Thanks, Mark, for the warm introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's really terrific to see this audience so interested in issues of housing policy, which increasingly, as I've been thinking about issues of inequality and social mobility in the US, I think is really central. So as you'll see in the talk I'm going to give today, I think housing policy issues and residential segregation are really at the centerpiece of understanding how to revive the American dream and tackle growing inequality and persistent poverty in the United States. So I'm going to talk about local housing markets, but I'm going to start at a very broad picture, picking up on some of the themes Mark mentioned, talking about the American dream, which has many different elements and is a complicated concept, but I'm going to distill it to one statistic that we can measure systematically in the data, which is the probability that a child born to parents in the bottom fifth of the income distribution makes the leap to the top fifth of the income distribution. So the Horatio-Alger version of climbing the income ladder of the American dream. So how common is that in the US versus other developed countries around the world where we have similar data? In the US, your odds of climbing from the bottom quintile to the top quintile are 7.5%. That compares with 9% in the United Kingdom, 11.7% in Denmark, and 13.5% in Canada. Now, in interpreting these statistics, you might react by saying, oh, even in Canada, your odds of success don't look all that high, right? Only 13.5% of kids make it to the top fifth. But in interpreting these numbers, you have to remember that 20% is kind of a plausible upper bound on what the statistic can be. So if you had a society where your parents played no role at all in determining your outcomes, you'd expect 1/5 of children from each of the quintiles to make it to the top fifth. And that's really the maximum, I think, plausible level of mobility that you'd have. So relative to that 20% upper bound, these are actually quite large differences in rates of upward mobility. One way you might think about it is that your chances of achieving the American dream are almost 2 times higher if you're growing up in Canada than in the United States. Now, these differences across countries have attracted a lot of attention and have led to worry that the US is no longer a land of opportunity as it was traditionally perceived. But what I'm going to focus on today and what I think is more relevant and what we can actually learn more from is that upward mobility varies even more across areas within the United States. In recent work with my colleagues Nathan Hendren, Pat Klein, and Emmanuel Saez, we calculate upward mobility for every metro and rural area in the US, and we do this using de-identified data from tax and Social Security records, which covers the entire population in the United States. And in this particular case, we're going to use data on 10 million kids born between 1980 and 1982, basically all children born in America between 1980 and 1982, and we use that data to construct this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility within the United States. So this map shows the same statistic that I started out with, the fraction of children who climb from the bottom fifth to the top fifth for 740 different metro and rural areas in the US, what are called commuting zones. And the map is colored such that lighter colored areas represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, and the dark red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So you can see if you look at the scale here that there's an incredibly broad spectrum in terms of rates of upward mobility within the United States. There are some places like the middle of the country where your odds of climbing from the bottom fifth to the top fifth exceed 16%, higher than the numbers we saw for Denmark and Canada, for instance. At the other end of the spectrum, if you look at places like Atlanta and Charlotte, your odds of climbing from the bottom fifth of the national income distribution to the top fifth are less than 4.5%, less than any country for which we currently have data. So even within America, there's an incredibly broad spectrum of rates of upward mobility, rates of achieving the American dream. Now in this big map, your eye is drawn towards the broad regional variation. The Midwest looks good relative to the Southeast. Parts of the West Coast, the Bay Area, for example, looks quite good at a 13% rate. Parts of the Northeast look quite good. But when you zoom in to finer areas, you see that there continues to be a lot of variation, even across local areas, even across local jurisdictions within a metro area. So take, for instance, the Bay Area. This chart here is showing you the same data at a county level instead of the metro area level, the fraction of kids going from the bottom to the top fifth of the national distribution. And you can see here that for children growing up in the 1980s, which is where this data is from, growing up in the 1980s in the Bay Area, your odds of succeeding in a low-income family growing up in San Francisco or San Mateo or where we are, Santa Clara counties, is incredibly high, something like 18%, which is really a phenomenally high rate relative to that 20% benchmark. In contrast, if you go over the Bay Bridge to Oakland, that number drops to 11%, so nearly a twofold difference just across two areas that are quite close to each other. So naturally, the question of interest to us as academics is to understand why upward mobility varies so much across these areas, and the question of interest to policymakers is to learn from this and figure out what we can do to improve mobility in places that don't look so good. So the first step in our analysis to figure out what's going on was to recognize that most of these differences that I'm showing you in these maps across areas appear to be driven by differences in childhood environment. So not so much differences in labor market conditions or the types of jobs that are available or things like that, which are all, of course, also important for economic opportunity. But we think the local area variation is actually predominantly driven by factors that relate to the childhood environment. Now, we reached that conclusion by studying about 5 million families that move between areas in the United States. So rather than getting into the details of that econometric analysis, I'm going to summarize what we find with a very simple example. Let's consider a set of families that start out in Oakland. And to make this concrete, suppose if you grow up from birth in Oakland, you are earning, let's say on average, $30,000, to pick a round number, when you're 30 years old. So consider a family who start in Oakland, set of families who start in Oakland, and move to San Francisco, which as we saw appears to generate better outcomes for kids in low-income families. And suppose if you grew up from birth in San Francisco, you'd earn $40,000, let's say, when you're age 30, when we measure income when you're 30 years old. So now consider a set of families that move from Oakland to San Francisco, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 9 years old. So we're going to look at this data based on the age of the child when the parents move. And we're going to start by looking at a set of families who moved when their son or daughter was exactly 9. And we tracked those children forward 21 years and measured their earnings using tax data to see how they're doing when they turn 30. And what we find is that those kids end up roughly halfway between the kids who grew up in Oakland from birth and the kids who grew up in San Francisco from birth. That is, they're earning roughly $35,000 on average. In a sense, they get about 54% of the gain of growing up in San Francisco from birth. So that's for the kids who moved when they were exactly 9. Now let's repeat that analysis for kids who moved when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, and so forth and so on as you go to the right on this chart. And what you see is a very clear pattern of declining effects. The later you make that move from Oakland to San Francisco, the less of the earnings gain you get. If you move in your early 20s, you get essentially no gain at all. And if you move after you're 21 or 22, there's absolutely no further impact. So what do you learn from this chart? I think there are 3 important takeaways. First, it appears that place matters. It's not just that the children who live in Oakland are different from the children who live in San Francisco. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child from Oakland to San Francisco, you see real measurable differences in that child's long-term outcomes. A particularly striking piece of evidence that led us to that conclusion is if you compare siblings within the same family. So take a family that moves with a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old from Oakland to San Francisco, you find that the 9-year-old is doing better than the 13-year-old exactly in proportion to that 4-year age gap when they make that move. So when you control for family-level factors by comparing siblings within the same family, you find exactly this pattern, which really suggests that place matters. Second, why does place matter? It looks like childhood environment is what's critical, right? If you move when you're an adult, it doesn't do a whole lot for you. It's really about moving when you're a child. And third, every extra year of exposure to a better environment seems to matter roughly equally. If you move when you're 9 instead of 10, or 15 instead of 16, you get about the same gain, about a 4% improvement in your long-term outcomes. That's important in light of current discussions about early childhood intervention. These data show that improving environments, even for kids at older ages, through housing policies or other policies, can be quite valuable. So next, having established that childhood environment really seems to matter, and that some places seem to generate much better outcomes for kids than others, we went about trying to think about, what is it about these places like San Francisco or Salt Lake City that have really high rates of upward mobility? What are they doing that leads to better outcomes for children relative to other places like Atlanta, for instance, or the city of Oakland? And it's very difficult to answer that question, so figuring out the recipe for success is an extremely difficult challenge. What we've done so far is identify the systematic correlations, the systematic patterns that emerge in terms of the types of characteristics of cities that generate high levels of mobility. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly summarize these here and then talk about why this leads us to think about issues of housing policy. So there are a set of factors we've considered. This slide here lists the 5 strongest correlations we've identified. So first, as you might expect intuitively, places with better public schools tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Second, places with less inequality, in particular a larger middle class, more people between the 25th and 75th percentile of the national distribution, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Third and fourth, coming from the sociology literature, we find that places with more stable family structures, in particular more 2-parent households, tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility. And somewhat similarly, places with higher levels of social capital, a concept popularized by Bob Putnam at Harvard in his book Bowling Alone, places that are more socially cohesive. So think of Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church as being a leading example of a place thought to have a lot of social capital. Those types of places also tend to have higher levels of mobility, perhaps because somebody else in the community helps you out, even if you're not doing so well, or points you to the right opportunities, pathways to success, and so forth. The pattern that I'm going to focus on here is the 5th one, which is we find that cities that are less residentially segregated tend to have higher levels of mobility. And I think this 5th factor is closely intertwined with all the other factors on the slide, because cities, for instance, that are less residentially segregated also are likely to have better public schools for kids from low-income families because they can rely on the funding base of higher income people, for example. They also might be more socially cohesive and have higher levels of social capital and so forth. So I think all of these factors are intertwined. And segregation in particular is something in the context of housing policy that we might be able to have an effect on. So just to show you how stark the patterns are in terms of segregation and how it's associated with upward mobility, let me show you a couple of examples. So this chart here gives you a visual depiction of racial segregation in the Atlanta metro area. The way it's constructed is that each person in Atlanta is represented by a dot. This is using census data. And the dots are colored so that whites are blue, blacks are green, Asians are red, and Hispanics are orange. You can see that regardless of how you measure segregation, it's immediately obvious that Atlanta is an incredibly segregated city. The blue dots are just completely separated from the green dots, for instance, in terms of where people are living. Now, Atlanta and cities that look like it in terms of segregation have some of the lowest levels of upward mobility in our data. Now, compare that with Sacramento, which has the same Black and Hispanic share, the same minority share as Atlanta, and you can immediately see that Sacramento is a much more integrated city than Atlanta. The colors are much more interspersed. It's by no means a perfectly integrated city. There's still segregation in Sacramento, but it's more integrated than Atlanta. And corresponding to that, Sacramento and places that look like it tend to have much higher levels of upward mobility. So this is a very robust pattern across all the cities in the US, this strong negative association between segregation, both by race and by income, and rates of upward mobility. And so that, I think, naturally motivates a focus on housing policy, policies that might change the structure of cities, change where people are living, as a tool to tackle chronic intergenerational poverty and improve economic opportunity. Housing, I think, is of particular interest, given that we already spend a lot of money in the federal government on various affordable housing programs. So roughly $45 billion on things like Section 8 housing vouchers, the low-income housing tax credit for developers to build affordable housing, public housing projects, and so forth. So we have this panoply of programs trying to provide affordable housing, and so especially given that expenditure, I think thinking about whether those policies are effective in improving outcomes and how they can be better structured to maximize economic opportunity in light of the evidence we've seen is a very important thing to do. Now, I want to note as a benchmark, before we start talking about housing policy, that standard economic theory with optimizing households and no other market imperfections would actually predict that cash grants of an equivalent dollar amount should be better than these specific housing policies, right? So the standard economic model would tell us that if I just give you $10,000 in cash instead of $10,000 in the form of a housing voucher, you should be able to do everything that you can do with a housing voucher with $10,000 of cash, and so why not just give you cash grants? So I think that's an important benchmark to keep in mind as we think about various housing policies. Think about why we're focusing on this particular form of intervention as opposed to something broader of just giving people cash transfers. And I'll have something to say on that in a minute. So given that we think housing policy could potentially have an effect on economic opportunity, perhaps by changing residential segregation, I'm going to talk here about two potential approaches to achieving the goal of trying to reduce segregation through changes in housing policy. The first is what I'll call a set of moving to opportunity policies, where we give families housing vouchers or use other affordable housing programs to help low-income families move to better areas. The second, recognizing that we can't possibly move everyone, is an approach of place-based investments. Think of things like changing zoning laws, local tax policies, investing in local public schools to try to integrate and improve areas that currently have less opportunity. So let me talk about each of these two approaches in more detail, starting with the moving to opportunity approach. So one concrete way in which you might think about improving outcomes is to give low-income families subsidized housing vouchers to move to better areas. So in thinking about this policy, it's important to note that I don't think of this as taking a set of families that are really committed to an area and uprooting them and having them move somewhere else. I think it's very important to note that 20% of low-income families already move houses each year. And so the way I think about these policies is redirecting the flows, redirecting where they're searching for housing, showing them that maybe moving to a different neighborhood will have beneficial impacts for their kids. Now, this idea of moving to opportunity is something people had thought about in the Clinton administration, where in the 1990s they tested this type of system by giving families vouchers to move to better areas, lower poverty census tracts, using a randomized lottery. So in a very famous experiment called the HUD Moving to Opportunity experiment, these roughly 5,000 families in 5 large cities in the US got vouchers to move to lower poverty census tracts. To give you a concrete sense of how this works, this is how it looked in the New York City site. So we took a set of families that started out in the Martin Luther King Towers, a very high poverty public housing project in Harlem, and some of those families, purely by chance, got a voucher to move to a lower poverty area, which many of them used to move to a place called Wakefield in the North Bronx, about 10 miles away from Harlem. So essentially what this experiment is asking is, how well the kids who grew up in the Bronx, 10 miles away from Harlem, do as adults relative to the kids who stayed in the public housing projects in Harlem. In recent work that I've done with Nathan Hendren and Larry Katz, looking at the long-term impacts of this experiment, we find that this simple move of changing where you live by 10 miles had profound effects on children's life paths. Children who moved to low poverty areas when they were young do much better as adults. They're earning 30% more. They're 27% more likely to attend college. They're 30% less likely to become single parents. But moving, importantly, had little effect on the outcomes of children who were already teenagers, and it also had no effect on parents' earnings. So once again, this echoes the theme that I was talking about earlier, that exposure to the better neighborhood during childhood really seems critical. Moving families when kids are young really seems to be what's critical for having long-term effects. Now, one challenge to this moving to opportunity approach is that areas that offer better opportunity tend to be more expensive. So you might think intuitively, okay, this sounds like a good idea. Let's help more of these families move to these places with good schools, et cetera, but isn't that going to be incredibly expensive? Moving lower income families to places like Palo Alto is not really a plausible, scalable policy. But a very important thing to note here is there appear to be lots of what we call opportunity bargains in the data, areas with relatively low rents that nevertheless appear to offer good opportunities for kids. And by using big data, these types of data sets that I've been showing you here that cover the entire population, we can identify these areas and target vouchers more effectively. So let me give you an example of this. So this is from our ongoing work trying to identify these opportunity bargains at a finer level, at a zip code level. And this is giving you an example from the New York area, where every dot on this chart represents a zip code in New York. And on the y-axis is our index of opportunity, basically the impact of living in different zip codes on children's earnings in adulthood. At the top, the places at the top increase your earnings by 20%, the places at the bottom decrease your earnings by 20%. Now on the x-axis is the average monthly rent in the zip code. And you can see, as you might expect, that places that are more expensive tend to generate better outcomes for low-income kids. So to take one example, Park Slope, which is where Mayor de Blasio used to live, is a very expensive part of New York and also generates pretty good outcomes for kids. So that's an expensive way to buy opportunity, if you will. Now, but interestingly, you can go horizontally on that chart, go to a place like East Midwood or Rockaway Park in New York, which offer basically the same level of opportunity, same impact on kids' outcomes as Park Slope, but are half the price. And that, I think, is the type of place where Section 8 voucher holders could potentially go in order to really see improvements in their kids' long-term outcomes. So I think there's a real potential to improve children's outcomes here using this approach of moving to opportunity. Mark, how much time do we have? Take another 5 minutes. Okay, let's wrap up in 5 minutes. Okay, so let me just wrap up by talking briefly about implications for the design of housing vouchers and say a quick word about place-based policies. So one thing to note is that these vouchers can save taxpayers money relative to public housing projects. Given the children's gain in earnings downstream, the government actually ends up gaining tax revenue from these types of policies relative to public housing projects. So I think you shouldn't think of this as a very expensive strategy. Second, I think vouchers should be targeted at families with young children for the reasons I've already emphasized. Third, vouchers should explicitly encourage families to move to affordable, high-opportunity areas, these opportunity bargains. Our sense from other research is that when you give families cash grants, they actually don't use that money to move to these sorts of areas, maybe because they don't have the right information or they don't have the appropriate assistance to find housing in those places. And so doing something more targeted through housing policy can actually make a lot of sense. I want to say a quick word about the second approach that I mentioned, which are these place-based approaches. So naturally, you can't move everyone from Harlem to the Bronx, right? That's not really a scalable policy solution. And so I think it's important to think about other policies that can increase residential integration without directly moving low-income families. So what might these policies be? They could be tax credits to encourage building affordable properties in high-income neighborhoods, retaining housing options for low and middle-income families as cities start to gentrify, investing in local public infrastructure, things like local public schools that directly improve communities and attract higher-income families to a given area. More broadly, I think thinking seriously about the architecture of cities and urban planning, issues like the design of transit systems and zoning, all of these policies have a really profound effect on whether cities end up looking like Atlanta or like Sacramento, and I think all of those policies can be extremely important. I'm going to end by talking about one final issue that I think is very important in the political debate. So if we think that integration, residential integration, can really help low-income kids' outcomes, that's good for those families, but often a prominent concern that comes up in the discussion of such policies is that there might be spillovers to high-income families that could potentially limit the overall gain from such integration. So we've seen that moving people from Harlem to the Bronx improves their own outcomes, but does it have negative effects on the outcomes of the people previously living in the Bronx? This is, I think, politically extremely important because this leads to a concern among middle and high-income families that they don't want lower-income folks to move into their neighborhood because they think they might be hurt by that. So as best we can tell, empirically in the data that we look at, we find that more integrated neighborhoods have, if anything, slightly better outcomes for children in richer families rather than worse outcomes. So in the data that I was showing you for the the entire US, there's no clear evidence of a hard trade-off between better outcomes for low-income kids and worse outcomes for high-income kids. And so I think that's quite reassuring in thinking about integration through housing policy as a potential solution to revive the American dream. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Thanks. That's great. So I'm only going to ask, I think, one question just so that we can get get some student questions and from others. And there's many things that I would like to ask about. But I guess one question I have, you talked a bunch about federal housing policy, and today we'll have a session on that, which will be great. We'll also have some discussion of state and local policies. And I'm curious if in your you've been learning about this area and have seen what's been happening across the US, are there places where states or localities that are doing innovative things that are kind of in the spirit of what your research suggests would make sense, and that other places might be able to learn from?
Yeah, I think there are a number of interesting efforts occurring, particularly at the local level. I think the most dynamic efforts in housing policy, particularly in the context of improving economic mobility, are in specific places like, for instance, here in San Mateo, there's an effort to try to provide counseling services and sort of a broker model to help low-income families search for housing in areas that might work better for them. There's a similar effort in Baltimore, which is one of the most segregated cities in the US, as you've all heard in the news, has some of the most serious problems, this area. There's an effort to try to provide, again, counseling and broker services to help families, fix their past record in terms of credit history and so forth. Really, intensive effort to help families locate housing in better areas. So those are kind of the moving to opportunity approaches that I think are promising models for other places to look at. There are also lots of place-based investments that are promising. So one example is the Harlem Children's Zone, which many of you have heard of, trying to improve schools in Harlem with, I think, quite a bit of success. There are a number of other programs like that. A number of them, Mark, I think, remain to be evaluated, so we don't know for sure yet exactly what works and what doesn't in that area, but certainly a number of interesting examples to study.
And I said 2 questions for me, right? So I'm going to ask one other. So the one thing about the framework that you're looking at is sort of seeing how people's relative economic performance changes, let's say, versus their parents or versus other kids. And one thing that we've heard a lot about is, given that the sort of median income and so forth has been pretty stagnant relative to, let's say, previous years, how do you think about this kind of relative versus absolute mobility? Are the sort of recent changes in the economy, maybe even if relative mobility is remaining the same, absolute mobility could be going in a different direction?
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, so the way we look at the data, we're basically asking whether a given child moves up in the distribution. But since any one local area is quite small relative to the US as a whole, it's basically like we're looking at the absolute earnings of a given child and seeing whether they're higher if you grow up in San Francisco versus Oakland, for example. But the question you ask, I think, is an important one in thinking about, is this like a game of musical chairs where if a low-income child does better, that basically, there's some other high-income child somewhere who doesn't get the same job, who gets displaced? That's a really hard question to answer because we need to know kind of in equilibrium what happens when one child does better. Is it like a zero-sum game, or do we think there's positive growth overall? I think there are at least some examples where we think there's likely to be positive growth on net. So think about children becoming inventors, for example, or scientists or entrepreneurs starting new business. Typically, we think that that's going to help everyone else do better as well. It's not like they're just taking a bigger piece of the pie for themselves at the expense of others. So my sense, Mark, is that relative and absolute mobility can go in the same direction. We don't know for sure. That's not necessarily always the case, but I think of these policies as potentially being beneficial overall.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raj. So I'm going to open it up now for questions, and I'm going to try to get a student to ask the first question. So let's see. There are a number of students here. Libby, I'm going to ask them. President of Stanford in government, right?
Yeah, that's true. Part of what's really interesting to me is that you were able to look at children in the 80s and their performance today, but how have rising housing prices in places like the Bay Area affected the ability to find these bargain places? Because today it's harder for me to imagine a family with young children being able to afford to move to an area of high opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. Actually, what I'm going to do is just flip to this slide at the end here, which speaks exactly to your question, which was this interesting analysis that was done by The Atlantic magazine using the data that we put out. that basically said, given these 5 factors, things like segregation and so forth, that seem to be highly correlated with mobility, what do we think mobility is going to look like for kids currently growing up in the Bay Area? We can't study that question directly in the data, of course, because we're going to have to wait 20 years to see what their earnings are. But we can make a prediction given exactly as you just asked, how housing prices are trending, how segregation is trending, how quality of schools is trending, and so forth. And the title of this article summarizes their finding, and I think the answer to your question, which is they called the Bay Area the place where the poor once thrived. The idea being that if you look at current levels of segregation in the Bay Area, look at the current degree of measures of social capital, family structure, and so forth, you wouldn't think that the Bay Area is going to have a very high level of mobility for the current set of kids. And so I think these issues are particularly important for us to think about, given the way things are trending in this area locally and more broadly in terms of rising house prices, greater segregation, and so forth.
Okay, great. Another student right back here, you had a question too, right? So can we get a microphone to her? Yeah.
So we talked a lot about like families from low-income neighborhoods moving to higher-income neighborhoods and the higher-income neighborhood becoming integrated. But it seems like the neighborhood they're leaving behind will stay the same, and it'll just be replaced by another like low-income family. So how do you integrate also like the low-income neighborhoods?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's exactly why I think a strategy of just trying to move a subset of families, there are roughly 2 million families that get housing vouchers in the US, that can't be a solution in and of itself because you're going to leave people behind and you can only move a small number of people at the end of the day. And so I think you have to think about how to invest in place and improve communities where low-income people live, either by making them attractive for higher-income folks by improving the quality of schools or improving transit options, reducing levels of crime. All of that will endogenously, I think, bring a higher income set of people into the community, which will then create more integration and do various things that will improve outcomes. Or just directly trying to figure out, like I think of the Harlem Children's Zone as an example again, that's an investment in a poor community in an area where we think things were not working well, the schools. And I think those types of investments are extremely important. The challenge there, as I was saying earlier, is we don't have great evidence yet on exactly which types of place-based investments work. But my hope is with the increasing availability of excellent data, we'll be able to figure out the answer to those questions.
Okay, great. Next question. We have a question at the very back, right in front of Sammy. Yeah.
I was just curious, does the spread between the upper quintile and the lower quintile affect the level of mobility? In other words, when you compare inequality between areas, do they affect people's ability to move around? And does it correlate to segregation?
Right. So let me say a couple things there. So first, just to be clear, when we're talking about the bottom quintile and the top quintile, it's always fixed in the national distribution. So we're not using the quintiles in the local area. We're using the quintiles in the nation as a whole. Nevertheless, you might ask, does inequality correlate with differences in upward mobility? So when there's more spread between, say, the 20th and 80th percentile in a given area, is that associated with lower chances of climbing the rungs of the ladder in the national distribution? And the answer to that is yes. And in particular, greater inequality of smaller middle class is correlated with having more residential segregation as well. So this is why I was saying all of these things seem to kind of go together. Places that are more segregated tend to have more inequality. They tend to have weaker public schools for low-income kids. They tend to have less social capital, et cetera. Piecing out exactly what the causal effects are, what's the mechanism? Is it segregation that's having an effect on inequality that's then having an effect on mobility, or is it some other pathway? Is hard to do, but I think the answer to your question is yes, these things all go together.
Another question right here.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I was wondering about so it seems that in your research, the component of the stability of low-income or minority families in the neighborhoods, it's a critical component. And I was wondering how can you promote the stability, the permanence of a low-income family in an affluent neighborhood with a voucher regime, right? Because so they maybe with a voucher they may able to move,
right?
But then if they have good schools, etc., later on, like other more affluent families will want to come to those neighborhoods and then may expose the low-income families. So how would you do that?
Excellent question. It's a really important question from a practical perspective. So what we see in the data is a lot of families that get vouchers, even among the ones who move, many of them end up moving back to the area they came from, or they get further displaced. They're not able to stay in these high opportunity areas. And so I think you can't view this as just like a one-shot thing. I help you move and then we're out of the picture and provide no further support. The programs that are most successful, like the Baltimore and San Mateo ones I was mentioning to you, Mark, are programs that continue to offer assistance even after the family moves. So they continue to have counselors who check in, figure out, are you able to keep up with your rent payments? If not, how can we help you balance your budget so that you are able to pay the rent? If rent is going up, is there another house in a similar area that you could move to? So I think this is a continued process. If you continue to get the voucher assistance year after year, these vouchers can be quite substantial in monetary terms, right? They can be several $1,000s. And so even, I think, in the face of rising rents, especially if you focus on those places that I was calling opportunity bargains, now they may not stay bargains forever, as you point out, so you have to keep reassessing. But I think you can help families stay in these areas if we're careful about how we design the policies.
Okay, thanks. And one more question, right here. Derek. Sorry, Celia.
So I'm really interested in the aspect of transportation. So I'm just wondering if you know of any best practices for like different types of transportation combinations to promote such mobility.
Yeah, so transportation comes up a lot in this discussion because a different way to try to increase integration is not to try to move people around or change the structure of cities, which is really expensive, but to try to create more public transit options. And in fact, we find that places with better public transit also seem to have better outcomes for kids from low-income families. The challenging thing in all of these questions is figuring out exactly what the causal effect of better transportation is. So, if we create another stop in the subway line, does that, really improve outcomes? We don't have really systematic evidence on that yet, and so while I think it's certainly plausible, given the evidence that I've shown you, that could be an important channel, I would want to see further studies of whether certain types of transportation infrastructure investments can really have long-term effects before making statements about any particular policy in that area. But I definitely think it's an area worthy of further consideration in this context.
Okay, I think we should wrap it up there if we want to stay on schedule. So please join me in thanking Raj Shetty.